Okay, great, let's start. So, now it's time for Patrick Girard from Apple. Tell us about Ceteris paribus logic and counterfactual reasoning.
Thanks so much. Hi, Mom. I'd first like to start the talk by acknowledging the presence of Zifu here. Hi, Zifu has been very patient and drawing awesome ultimate robots. But he's been really patient. Maybe one day you choose to spend a weekend sitting in a room like that and thinking to yourself how awesome it was and how lucky you are to participate in it. So thanks for the organizers for having me. This is about Ceteris paribus logic and counterfactual reasoning. I tend to say Ceteris paribus. It may be Ceteris paribus, but I can't pronounce the English, so I might as well mispronounce the Latin anyway. What is Ceteris paribus first? I take it from an example that goes to Georgia Bonfret in the 60s on this book in Preference Logic. So if I say Ceteris paribus, I prefer my raincoat to my umbrella. Here are the worlds where you have your raincoats. Here are the worlds where you have your umbrellas. And it's always the case that you prefer your raincoat to your umbrella, where an arrow points to preferred states. Of course, if you compare a world where you have your raincoat and you don't have your boots, you would prefer a world where you have your boots and an umbrella, but you rule it out by having your boots equal. So, if you don't have your boots, you prefer your raincoat to your umbrella. If you have your boots, you still prefer your raincoat to umbrellas, and you rule out the other. You rule out like cross classes links. Same kind of idea that you see in the formulation of Bohr's law. That says, in my formulation, Ceteris paribus, the absolute pressure exerted by a given gas of an ideal gas is inversely proportional to the volume it occupies. In particular, you want to keep the temperature knob constant. You set that knob and then you look at the ratio between the volume and pressure and you get that. And it doesn't matter where you set the knob, but you always want to keep it constant. Same kind of reasoning, I think, happens for the Nash equilibrium, where here you think of keeping others' strategies constant. You can't control what others do. So should common player play AI, your best response is to come here. And likewise, should row player play BJ, then your best response is to come here. And no individuals has incentive to deviate from these strategies. Ceteris paribus. Where Ceteris paribus, that just means you keep other strategies constants. It may be that this is a lot more preferable than this states, but again, that goes across the classes. So it's that general type of reasoning that I take Ceteris paribus to be, and that's what I want to merge it with counterfactuals. So in counterfactuals, going back to, is there a way to shut these lights? It seems like people might not be able to read from the back, I reckon. Is that better? All right, cheers. Okay, so going back to David Lewis' book on counterfactuals in '73, if kangaroo had no tails, they would topple over. Here's a model, well, two models. The way Lewis analyzed it was by saying something like, in each of the most similar worlds where kangaroos have no tails, they topple over. Now the question is, which are the most similar worlds? I take counterfactuals to be conditionals with false antecedents, basically. And so W would be the real world where it's not the case that kangaroos have no tails, and I suppose they don't topple over. And then you have your space of possible worlds, and you order them in terms of similarity. And if it happens that the closest world are worlds where kangaroos have no tails and topple over, then the counterfactuals, if K then T, would come out true. If it's the case that your nearest worlds are worlds where they don't have okay, it should be K instead of T, then it would be false. It depends on where you start from and which of the worlds are the most similar. So it's that kind of idea. Now, so it's this idea that you reduce basically the analysis of counterfactuals over some kind of primitive understanding of what similarity relations are. And Kit Fine, in his review, I think it's in the review of symbolic logic, if I remember, it's 75, I came up with this counterexample to this analysis of counterfactual, which I call the Nixon counterfactual. And I say we, that involves Marcus Triplett, who's still in Oakland, so he's my co-author student and good friend now. So Nixon counterfactuals obviously involves Nixon, it involves a button, it involves the nuclear holocaust, and it involves a miracle. And a miracle here, for those who are more sophisticated about these theories here, it doesn't have to be a divine intervention that is sort of, it doesn't have to be a full-blown impossible kind of miracle. Anything will do. For the purpose of this talk, I'll just talk about miracles, and it's probably okay if you go with the divine intervention kind of story. I'll do the job, but I am aware that it's a lot more sensitive to it, especially when you start talking about miracles with Lewis. We can talk about this later. Okay, so the Nixon counterfactual, that's what Kid Fine proposed. And it's basically that this counterfactual, if Nixon had pushed the button, there would have been a nuclear holocaust. And this is meant to be a true counterfactual. Both Fine and Lewis agree explicitly in text that the counterfactual is true. I tend to agree with it. If you don't agree with it, it doesn't matter all that much. Just, let's just assume that it's true. It's to run Kid Fine's argument. So here you have 4 propositions. P stands for Nixon pushes the button. S for the missile successfully launches. M is where the miracle involves. A small miracle prevents the missile from being launched. The way he describes it is as Nixon pushes the button, like a small piece of wood from the corner of the room just like flies in and comes and blocks it. So that's the sort of divine intervention kind of story. But you could think of it as some kind of spy that came the day before in the White House and just rigged the wires. Either way will work. But something prevents the button from working. And there's a nuclear holocaust occurs. And here's the model. So we're in the real world. Presumably Nixon didn't push the button and all the propositions are false. And Fine's argument is that a world in which Nixon pushes the button but there's a small miracle that prevents the missile being launched is more similar to the actual world. It's just a tiny deviation, pushes the button, small miracles, but everything is absolutely equal otherwise. So it's as similar as it gets to the real world. And if that's the case, if you accept that story, then you end up with saying that the counterfactuals is false, and this model would get the wrong analysis of the counterfactual, and that's supposed to be a challenge to counterfactual theory, right? Okay, so in response to that, Lewis, that's in the paper, I forget the one about backward time and stuff, forget the name, I'm not good with names and dates and titles. But Lewis, and it was also already in the book, I don't want to be too unfair, but he thought in response to that, you would just argue that actually the model that Fine gave was not the appropriate model for the situation. And he gave these 4 things as some kind of recipe or priorities of desiderata that you should satisfy when you're building up models. So it's of the first importance to avoid big, widespread, diverse violations of laws. It's the second importance to maximize the spatio-temporal region throughout which perfect match of particle fact prevails, and so on and so on. And now I'm just going to read how Lewis in text says that you can use that. Based on the system of priorities, world U1 is more similar to W than V1 because perfect match of particular facts counts for much more than imperfect match, even if the imperfect match is good enough to give us similarity in respects that matter very much to us. Now, the point is that if we accepted this system of priorities when we build up models, we end up with, this should be an L as opposed to an F, the Lewis models, in which actually the similarity is reversed. That even though it's just a tiny miracle, and it looks, naively more similar, if you're a bit more sophisticated in the way you think of your similarity relations, then actually it is that world that is the most similar, and then you recover the truth of your counterfactual. Right, so Lewis's strategy is to say, well, yeah, fine, you'd be right, but you got the wrong model to analyze the story. And what I think so what do I think about it? It's like, what I don't like about the system of priorities is like, if you draw a model and you say of your relations, they should be reflexive, they should be transitive, they should be total, they should be, these kind of things. And then you have a bullet that says, and there shouldn't be no miracles. Or like, it should be a good model. Right? It's just not the kind of things that you want to exclude. To me, it feels a bit ad hoc as well as an explanation as to why you choose that model over the other one. It's not so ad hoc for Lewis because he was aware of that, and in the book he was defending, it was a lot more sophisticated, but it still feels like the kind of constraint that I'd like to avoid in a different way. And the way I'm going to avoid it is by using Ceteris paribus. Right? Okay, so first a piece of notation. I'm going to say that two worlds, W and V, are equivalent with respect to a set of information, gamma, if and only if they agree on the formulas that are true. So if W has something true, then so does V, and if it has it false, then so does V. So they fully agree on the information that gamma has. So they take gamma as colors, and the way they color W and the way they color V comes out the same. So then they're in perfect agreement. In the case before, having boots would be the kind of things that you could have. And then we'll say that phi is true in every most similar phi worlds, but then you add on top of it that they must agree on gamma. So when you choose your most similar phi worlds, your antecedent satisfying worlds, you're just going to make sure that they preserve the other things equal, where gamma contains these other things that you want to preserve equal. I'm going to write the counterfactual using the Challis notation here. So the antecedent is here, phi. So if phi were the case, psi would be the case, and you keep gamma equal. So that's the modality as I write. So you just index a set gamma and you ask it to be preserved. You can recover Lewis's counterfactual just by putting the empty set. And it's fairly easy to see that if you put the empty set, then that clause becomes vacuously true, so you just piggyback on the similarity relation. Okay? So that's how the modality works. Yeah, one thing. So when I say Ceteris paribus, I think that's mostly to philosophers that I'm addressing myself. A lot of people will think of Ceteris paribus as giving you the normal conditions of evaluation. And for instance, that was Martin Smith, for instance, wrote a paper on Ceteris paribus counterfactuals, and for him he was saying the content of a Ceteris paribus conditional is essentially this: the most normal worlds in which antecedent and consequent jointly hold are more normal than the most normal worlds in which the antecedent holds and the consequent fails. And I think this kind of normality reading gets it wrong because of this kind of, I imagine Kata in Edmonton, she told me she hasn't been to the Rockies so far, but one day she'll make a trip to the Rockies and she may get lost in the middle of the winter with only one match in a blizzard, and she considers whether she should strike that match. And if, she asks herself, why I just strike the match and put light? Then if you read the normality Ceteris paribus, then you're kind of back home by your fireplace with a glass of wine kind of thing, where you strike your match. And that's not what you want to know. You want to know what happens with respect to that world here. I think that's the locality that modal logic gives you is quite important here. And the normality reading destroys that locality, which I think the equality preserves, and I think it's to its great advantage. So that's why, that's the novelty in our reading. Okay, so then if you apply it to the fine model, you just back to the fine model as it was, and you keep your naive similarity just as it is given by fine. You don't need to, it's reflexive and transitive and there's nothing else about it. And you keep the naive idea that, yeah, this world where there's a small miracle is, it's indeed more similar, there's fewer changes, like naively, but you insist that you preserve there being miracles equal. Right? So if we live in a world, assuming that here we live in a world where there's no miracle, then when you go to your most similar worlds, you want to keep that equal, and you just recover the same world that Lewis wanted to zoom in, but you don't need to change the relation as such. The logic can cope with it by keeping things equal. Right? So I think the counterfactual is true, but there's an implicit Ceteris paribus clause that says, no miracles basically should be kept equal. Of course, locally, if it is the case that there was a spy that went and fiddled with the wires in the White House and Nixon actually pushed it, I don't know. I don't know what W is in its full features, but that will be inherited from whatever happens here. Ceteris paribus will keep that equal when you go and evaluate it. Alright, so that's how we analyze it in the Ceteris paribus way. There's a great thing here. I think it helps especially for the rest of the talk, and there's a nice link to think about it in a dynamic way. That you can think of there being, you have your old similarity relation, and dynamically when you choose to keep n constant, you update your relation, and you only preserve the links that keep your information constant. In that case, both of these links are broken. So you could think of it as a dynamic modality where you take in your initial relation and then you impose some conditions that you want to keep equal, and that updates your relation, and then you analyze your modalities, that your information there. That's another way of thinking about it. Where do we go from here? Is there a way to... What's my time? I forgot to look at my starting time.
No, you got 10 minutes.
I got 10 minutes?
Yeah, we might run. No, I think you have 10 minutes.
Oh, I've got 10 minutes. Okay, cool. So, you may want to have a general procedure for selecting sets. So what it is that you're going to keep equal, you're going to keep everything else. But what is everything else? There was a proposal that, well, Vanfrit, when he was talking about preferences, had this idea that what you're going to first identify what your universe of discourse is. So to illustrate it, we have these counterfactual. If Nixon had pushed a button, called that P, there would have been a nuclear holocaust H, in that we have, say, in our language, 4 propositional atoms, and we're going to keep, since the counterfactual is about P and H, we're going to keep everything else equal. So that means there being miracle and S as well. Right? If you do that, and then you can define it recursively. So that could be a uniform way of choosing what information you're going to keep constant. You define it recursively. Basically, you take phi and you take psi, you consider all the atoms that occur, and you let those vary, and everything else has to stay equal. So that would be one way of doing it. In the case of the counterfactual, however, what happens is it's just too strict. And dynamically, it breaks all the links, because from here to here, well, neither S nor M are preserved, because here you lose, S was false here, S is true here. So that link breaks, so everything breaks, and you just end up with triviality, where both counterfactuals end up being true. So that's, bugger. So what do you do about that? What we thought we could do about it is to think about relaxing the Ceteris paribus clause, so that instead of keeping everything equal, you say, okay, I'm going to try to keep as much as I can equal. Basically, so as much as I can, right? So if logical atomism was true, then you could change anything arbitrarily. But if it's not true, then well, sometimes you can't like remove the electric current in a wire without removing the magnetic field, for instance. So those are nomological relations between your things that vary together. But you're going to try to keep as much as you can equal. And this can be made more precise in at least 2 ways that we thought about. So this set A, call that the set A between 2 worlds U and V, the agreement set. So 2 worlds have the same, so the agreement set is basically the formulas in gamma that they agree on. And then you're going to say that a world U is at least as similar as a world V with respect to gamma when you're trying to keep as much as you can equal, if one of 2 things. Either U actually does better in keeping things equal, or they keep the same information equal, and U is actually more similar in the order. So that means you have 3 worlds like that. You have P, Q, and R. Call that your set gamma, and then suppose you keep P here, and you could keep QR there, and then you have a counterfactual S, and then say SD. Then if you just go for normal counterfactuals, then it wouldn't be the case that If S is the case, then T is the case. But when you keep as much as you can equal from the set gamma, that you have T. Because even though this is your most similar worlds, it only preserves P, and this one preserves more. It preserves Q and R. So it does better at preserving information, so it takes you back along the similarity order. So if you want to preserve as much as you can equal, the payoff you might have to pay some similarity and go backward. When you do that on the fine model, so I gave you that example because I'm just keeping the fine model as a running example. It just happens that it does nothing to it. But it does something sometimes. Another way you could think about it, if you don't want to start counting, is you think about set containment in the agreement of the agreement sets. And that may generalize better for infinite collections because, you know, you could have two countable sets. They're of the same size, but they totally disagree. So that may generalize better in the infinite case. And in that case, when you go with the set containment, the update is slightly different, and you get this new model. Now you have two worlds that are equally similar, and it's not the case. You can't settle the question as to whether it comes out false that had you push the button, you'd get the Holocaust. Right? So you have three ways of going ceteris paribus. Either you insist on keeping everything equal, or you do as best you can by keeping as much information equal as you can. And there's two ways of doing that, either by counting like 1, 2, 3, 5, or just by going with a more qualitative set containment relation. Now a couple of slides, just to tell, is that good for a couple of slides? Yeah. So how do we deal with the logic? Now let's just assume we have finite sets from then on. I'd much prefer having infinite sets, but it's a lot more complex, and that's okay, because that just means it's work for the future. But how do we prove completeness? Well, first we go back to Lewis himself, and footnote to Johann, Lewis and to Johann and those who know or care about it, or maybe anyway, disjuncture. Lewis in the appendix, when he proves completeness for counterfactuals, reduces it to his notion of comparative similarity, which says that phi is at least as comparatively as possible to psi. And the definition here is a for all exist. And it's over pre-orders. It's a for all exist preference relation, right? And then using that modality, you can define your counterfactual. And Johan and myself and Olivier and Stuart at the time did a lot of work into reducing these kind of modalities to standard model logic, I think, right? Okay, so just a footnote, but it wasn't Lewis, of course. Lewis did it all. Okay, so the strategy is you use a simpler kind of modality, and then you can define counterfactuals, and proving completeness here is simpler. So whoa, I'm missing a step. So one step is just that we do exactly the same, but you put gammas. Right, so you just index everything with gammas, we have the same kind of reduction, that's the first step. And the second step, we're obviously not going to read these formulas because they're ugly as, but ugly as is a Kiwi expression.
The back of a dog's hind end.
It's like good as gold. Good as. I say that all the time. Sorry, I know. Anyway, the idea is that for each of these, the strict CP, the naive counting, and the maximal supersets, it's the strategy of reduction axioms that on the left-hand side, you have your modalities indexed with gammas, and on the right-hand side, you can analyze them down to the language without the gammas, and it gets ugly. It just gets really ugly, and it took us a year just to figure out what these bloody formulas were, but now we have them, so we're done, and that's completeness. Well, I did put that slide, but it was later, so, okay. Well, future work. So this business about miracles is a bit funny because with David Lewis has a notion of possible worlds being deterministic, and it would be great to go indeterministic. There's been some papers and some ideas as to why you want to do that. It seems to me that having this kind of ceteris paribus control in an indeterministic world would be great because you could, you know, you could say, oh, keep those things equal and then let the rest vary. So that's one of my future projects. I just realized that Alan Hayek has written a book, Most Counterfactuals Are False, which will be coming out soon. So, I mean, I haven't read the manuscript, so I shouldn't say all that much about it, but I hope it's the same kind of story that Ceteris paribus offers you, that, for instance, the Nixon counterfactual was false. And yeah, it's false if you have a naive notion of similarity, but if you use this sort of Ceteris paribus reasoning, then maybe you can recover truth of counterfactuals. Infinite sets, of course, everything I've done is finite. These reduction principles, if you had an infinite language, you could do it, but you'd need infinite conjunctions, and I don't know how to do that. In the simpler model logic, we've managed to categorize a class of sets that we can axiomatize. We call those flexible sets, and they're sort of monsters. I don't know how to do that, but I think that's a fascinating mathematical question. And because I'll talk and talk on Thursday, I thought I'd give something to game theorists. So, I mean, there is something about Nash equilibrium, so maybe we can use this kind of setup to introduce like Ceteris paribus counterfactuals in game theory. But I don't know how to do that because I'm not a game theorist, so please help me. Thank you.
Can you put on the slide again Lewis's response where he describes the way the model should be selected?
This?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, like, I mean, one general question is, like, I mean, I agree there's an issue here that it's not very nice that you have that he has to account for this somehow. But I'm not sure the situation is much easier now, because basically now, every time you write a counterfactual, you have to solve the same problem, right? So it's something you don't have to do it once.
Or you just say what they say about preferences. You say Ceteris paribus. I prefer wine over jelly beans.
Okay. But the other question is your formalism rich enough to somehow?
Say that again. Sorry.
Is your formalism with the gamma rich enough, sort of like to formalize this as a? I mean, can you? I don't know exactly Lewis's model, and I haven't read it in detail. But can you sort of describe this with some set gamma? Or,
Oh, let's see. If you can use some gamma to describe that.
Yeah. Can you incorporate this now in the formula using set gamma?
Good question. Good question. Yeah. Good, I don't know. Good idea. It's a good idea. Yes?
Hi, yeah, I work in AI, and one of the things we end up doing is we build systems based on applications using tools related to logic, and then we try to figure out what the properties are of those systems we've actually built.
Yes.
And that's the scary place that people are talking about right now, is what do we actually know and how can we think about limits and properties. But one of the things that is very real is that I often use multiple contexts. So I've seen a fair bit about trying to keep things consistent and trying to create one world over another. And in fact, I need to consider multiple worlds all the time. And a really good application for this, to bring it to reality, is distributed sensor networks.
Okay.
Whether that's over a small region, like say watching what happens in a particular country or a laboratory,
Right.
or whether it's over the whole planet, or whether it's over a particular region of the ocean. This is a really important application, and I need to preserve independence, say, of viewpoints based on these models that are interpreting data from sensors.
Yes.
So I want to actually preserve the differences. And right now I just use things like, multi-agent belief revisions. So I have sort of like Anderson and Belknap, the way they tagged each line with the context in which these things occurred. So that's kind of the way you build it. But I'm just saying that because I'd like to see that more somehow, or if somebody knows tools to help capture those properties, because those are real systems being built, and we kind of need that. And I see the logicians all the time trying to drive things down into a single consistent world, and I need to go the other direction. So, and we read the same in games.
Yes.
Each player, if you want to model the players and what's going on, their states are somewhat different.
Yes. Not sure if that's positive and negative. I think that's I take it positively.
Well, if you're involving users or data,
Yes.
in different locations, you have different perspectives.
Yes. Sure, but you may want to preserve certain informations about these different perspectives.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right, so that's good then.
So you have independent views, and that's information you don't want to lose.
Right, right.
That's all. Thank you.
That sounds good. It just reminds me of what they did with the CP nets and preference logic, and I wonder if the same kind of interactions. So the CP nets were Ceteris paribus nets, and there were ways to figure out, in a lot more applied things, how to choose items, say TVs. You know, if you have collections of TVs, you give me preferences about size, colors, and shape, and then I can order it, and then they do pairwise comparison that use the same kind of idea of Ceteris paribus, and it's supposed to eliminate complexity. I don't understand all that much, but it's the same kind of idea. So I wonder if what you're saying is similar to what, you know, it's the same kind of, you know, logician's dream with all these symbols, but that could have a lot more concrete control in
I don't know, I think it's maybe a longer conversation.
Right, no, great, yeah.
What is on that? Or?
Oh, no.
No, okay, so I'll answer my own question and then I'll get you. Because you don't have a long line, so I'll take the liberty. So no, I'm just curious about the, about how you understand the Ceteris paribus clause. I'm not sure that it matches up at all with my understanding. And
Right.
so what the locality point that you were making, right? So there's a sense in which, I mean, so I think that both Ceteris paribus conditionals and counterfactual conditionals have context sensitivities that are really intricate and interesting. I mean, the example of the snowstorm thing,
Yes.
right? I mean, so the locality there, I mean, sometimes that's not at all what needs to be held equal, nothing. And so suppose we got Nixon, he's about to press the button, I take a gun and I shoot him. Because that would be totally true. I mean, I think that could be a case, you know, where, you know, it's enough people are saved that it's permissible, right? But it could still be true at that moment that Ceteris paribus murder is wrong, right? Right? There's that. And I'm not saying that normality is what matters, but there are other things depending on what's being qualified by the Ceteris paribus clause. It's right.
Point taken.
Yeah. So okay. So that's.
Yes.
Is that compatible with what you're saying, or is it just that you don't you want to circumscribe this particular use of the Ceteris paribus clause and use it?
I did privilege that. I mean, I think, you know, keeping everything equal, that's what it means. You just keep what you have, keep that equal. It's not like fixing the background conditions. That's imposing background conditions. That's ideal conditions or background conditions. That's fine by me. I just find it funny to call it Ceteris paribus, but I don't think that answers your thing.
Yeah, no. Okay, so yeah, good.
I was intrigued by this comment you made that you're okay imposing constraints on your similarity relation, like reflexivity, transitivity, those formal constraints. But once you start saying anything substantive about the properties of the similarity relation, then you started to get worried. And I was wondering if that was some general methodological point, or you just don't like Lewis's particular list of priorities.
I guess is that there's a way to get logic to do it in the object language without having to impose that sort of non-mathematical substantive clause that says, give me nice models kind of thing. So it's a way for, you know, it's like logic can exclude so many models. When you give it a class of models, it can exclude some, you know, there's so much it can do. And in Lewis counterfactuals, it can't exclude Fine's model. The modeler can choose to exclude it on principle just by saying, oh, in metaphysics that doesn't hold. But I reckon the modeler doesn't need to do that if the logic can cope with it.
Yeah, but of course that model is in Lewis's model class.
Yes.
It's just that Lewis claims that that model does not correctly represent this real situation involving Nixon and so on.
Yes.
And Lewis's 4 rules concern, is this model an accurate model for this real situation?
But isn't it simpler to just say, forget about these rules and just control it with Ceteris paribus clauses, I guess. It's like, I'm not answering, I'm just repeating myself, I think. I understand what you're saying though.
But it's paribus because now we have to.
Yeah, it was. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it seems like at the end of the day, you might think there is some relation that is reflexive and transit and so on, whatever.
Yes.
So you're going to need.
Sure.
There is such a relation. So why is it less simple to appeal to it Is there? I mean, I guess I didn't totally follow the simplicity argument, but anyway.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I have a very general question because you now use the Ceteris paribus idea to the counterfactual reasoning. Just curious, what's the future direction? Do you see also other reasoning? The idea of Ceteris paribus can apply, for instance, default reasoning, or maybe other any reasoning.
Yeah. So far I've used it for preference. I guess it seems to apply in doxastic context as well. What I would believe in conditional kind of beliefs you could think about where conditional but keeping other things equal, and then you could choose to keep certain things equal. Default reasoning, sure. I mean, yeah, all of the above. I think it can generalize. The technique is just you take some logic with diamonds and you stick, you put a gamma in there, basically. So anywhere that it can be done reasonably, yeah, definitely. I think that's a general strategy. I think it's maybe that's another answer, that it sort of pinpoints a way of reasoning with generalities that have some exception. And if you don't have some kind of control on what counts as an exception to laws in general, that virtually nothing will ever be universal, because you can almost always come up with counterexamples by invoking miracles or invoking this or invoking that. But there's that kind of reasoning where you say, okay, I'm aware of counterexamples, but these counterexamples are not relevant to the kind of generality I'm after. Which I think that's the strategy of that kind of logic. So it's the logic for that type of reasoning. So maybe that also helps answering in a different way the kind of points that you were raising, to a certain extent. But that's how I understand it. Where logic identifies patterns of reasoning, well, keeping things constant is a way of reasoning.
Do you have a last question?
Sure. So, I mean, maybe this is. So I want to ask about nested conditionals and if you thought about how this is going to work. And of course, it's kind of not a really fair question because everyone has trouble with these. But I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about.
Yeah. Okay. So we didn't have thoughts. First, it's the dynamic version that I've given you. At first, we just let's go dynamics, and then we can iterate it, and it's all good. It turns out not to work all that well, and I mean it works. The way we define it has nested counterfactuals. It's just that we decide that each world has its own similarity orders, and once you have that, but that's a good old story. And we thought that going dynamic would help with that, but it doesn't match with our story. So I don't know how to iterate in the dynamic way. And I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. So no.
That's totally fair. I just
yeah.
Maybe you had a cool story that you can tell. But
It would be good, but if we can make the dynamic work.
Yeah.
There seems to be room, when you think about it dynamically, that may give us some kind of different insight on how to choose, but don't know yet. So.
Thanks.